What happens when you cross a team drowning in debt and falling further and further down the ladder with a manager that has no coaching experience and had barely watched a football game in 7 years? Easy money says you get a disaster. Newcastle, however, got something a little different.
I will love it if we beat them. Love it.
Ginola with the finish. What a finale!
We're sat on the biggest club in Great Britain, there's no doubt.
It's Shearer.
And trying really to win against all the odds. And I think that's, if I'm honest, that is what really appealed to me.
When Kevin Keegan joined Newcastle United for the second time in the early 90s, the club was on the brink of disaster, toiling in the second division, inches from the third, something that triggered the unthinkable: local fans losing interest. It got so bad that at 40 years old, long retired, now the manager, Keegan strongly felt that he was the best player that Newcastle had to offer, arguably the most explosive in just about every sense of the word. In only a few short years, all of that changed. It was an era of rebranding for the league, for the city, for the team, up against forces that many would describe as undeniable, unbeatable, and more. Newcastle United captured the hearts and minds of supporters of a league that was beginning an unprecedented global ascent in popularity. The story was truly one for the ages. However, before any of that was to come, the Magpies were admittedly in a bit of a rough spot. Also, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't. Newcastle United have just about always been a big football club. By the 50s, they had already collected 4 First Division titles, 6 FA Cups, and a dozen more runner-up medals. But thereafter, were restricted to mid-table berths before slipping even further. In the 60s and early 70s, Newcastle boasted attendances as high as 37,000 per game, reflective of their status as First Division mainstays. But as the years ticked on through the late 80s, that number dwindled further and further down, to the point where attendance had fallen to as low as 15,000 for a single game by the early 90s. Local interest was at an all-time low. Now, I don't want to mislead you. There were a lot of reasons for this. Football hooliganism was at an all-time high going into the 80s. Naturally, safety was a concern for match-going fans. There was a shift towards all-seater stadiums, thanks in large part to a plethora of stadium disasters directly linked to poor crowd control and failures of security. And on top of that, as far as Newcastle were concerned, they just weren't very good. After selling star players like Chris Waddle, Peter Beardsley, and Paul Gascoigne in the 80s, the club suffered relegation from the top flight in 1989 and failed in consecutive attempts to bounce back. Under manager Jim Smith, the team were playing, as Ian Cusack once wrote in the WSC magazine in 2001, stultifying, mundane football. To make matters worse, in 1990, Newcastle came close to promotion but lost the playoff to bitter rival Sunderland. And then in 1991, they again fell short of the playoffs. The 91-92 season began disastrously. Osvaldo Ardiles was brought in as manager with a mandate to introduce attractive passing football using the club's talented youngsters. However, with virtually no transfer budget, reportedly under £250,000 in total, the team went ahead topping all the wrong tables, hovering in the relegation spots halfway through the year. As a matter of fact, Newcastle had the worst defense in the entire league over the course of the entire year, with 84 goals conceded. 84! Second worst was relegated Brighton with 77. Ardiles was deemed to not be up to scratch after a 5-2 loss to Oxford and was sacked halfway through the year, creating a managerial vacuum in the hot seat. A seat that, at this point, was thought to be cursed. Disaster beckoned as off-field power dynamics threw even more spanners in the works. Few at the top could agree on anything, which was an ongoing issue since at least 1988, and it persisted until 1991, when local millionaire Sir John Hall wrestled control from the old regime in a hostile takeover, becoming the main decision-maker. Still, few expected all that much of an upturn. Staring down the barrel of the third division like an animal backed into the corner, a last-ditch decision was made. It was a romantic choice, a bold choice, perhaps a nonsensical choice. Newcastle's top brass, who already had a shaky reputation, decided to bring on a man who, albeit was once a Newcastle hero as a player, had retired 7 years prior and had spent all the time in between refining his bunker game in Marbella. Kevin Keegan.
Keegan! What a magnificent goal! Kevin Keegan gets the hat-trick.
Kevin Keegan's credibility in Newcastle stemmed from his truly unprecedented playing career. Born in 1951, Keegan had been one of Europe's top footballers in the 70s. At Liverpool, he won 3 First Division titles, the FA Cup, the European Cup, and captained England regularly. He then moved to Hamburg, won the Ballon d'Or twice in 78 and 79, and remains the only Englishman to win more than one of these. By 1982, Keegan was arguably at the peak of his fame, back in England and now playing for Southampton. He had his best season return from a stats perspective, netting 26 goals and assisting 9 in 41 games for the Saints. As Southampton finished 7th, Keegan directly contributed to 49% of their goals. The reason I bring this up is so you can all understand why his next move was shocking to some. Second-tier Newcastle United, a coup that saw local fans in rapture, although in reality it wasn't all that surprising to anyone in the know.
My affiliation with the club goes back a lot further. My father was a Geordie. So I heard about a lot of players that he used to come and watch here.
Keegan has claimed multiple times that while he was a player, he always believed he would don Newcastle's black and white. It was just a matter of time. He spent 2 seasons as a player on Tyneside, adding steel and bite to a young team, scoring 49 in 85 games. Ultimately, he helped Newcastle achieve promotion in 1984 before retiring as a player. This stint cemented Keegan as a folk hero, a reputation that stuck with him when he walked away from the game. Apart from coming out of retirement for 2 games in the Australian National Soccer League in 1985, that was that. And from then on, Keegan decided that he would step away from the game almost entirely. Other than brief guest and punditry appearances, he was more or less true to his word, moving his family to Marbella, Spain, playing golf in the sun, eating good food. Truly, he was living the life. Adding on to that, he also proclaims that he only watched 2 live matches in that entire period, one being a European Cup final, the other a goalless draw between Blackburn Rovers and Newcastle United. His retirement was going swimmingly until he got a phone call. On the other end of the phone was the 123rd richest man in the entirety of the UK, Sir John Hall. The man had a special, albeit unorthodox offer. Some would rather refer to it as a roll of the dice. Keegan had admitted that he was unprepared, inexperienced, and unfamiliar with the modern game's technical trends. Nevertheless, the pull of Newcastle United, the club of his father, the club he had once lifted as a player, was too grand to ignore. And so, in February 1992, midway through the 91-92 season, nearly 8 years after he'd last kicked a ball professionally, a 40-year-old Keegan returned to St. James's Park, backed by Hall's ambition and the faith of a desperate fan base.
He's well known to you all, and he's well known to the people in the region. And I'd like, if you would come through the doors, please. Kevin Keegan.
When Keegan first arrived in Newcastle as a player, the fanfare was incomparable. 10 years later, lightning struck twice. The effect of his return was monumental. As was likely one of the main objectives of the ownership, the plan to uplift the Toon fan base and get them believing again was an initial success. And on that note, nobody would blame you for believing that that was the only objective that would be met with this move. A man with no experience was immediately tasked with halting Newcastle United's downward spiral, ensuring that they never lived to taste the clutches of the 3rd Division. And it got off to a rocking start. In his first match in charge, 30,000 fans packed St. James's Park to see Newcastle beat Bristol City 3-0. The people already saw Keegan as a savior. However, the early months were far from smooth. Not only did Keegan inherit a squad low on confidence, but also facilities that had seriously been lacking the TLC they deserved. On arriving at the club's Benwell training ground, it was in a dilapidated state, literally in the process of being sold off. Keegan personally paid for a weekend cleanup of the grounds as an indirect message to the players of the required standard. Assessing the team, he and assistant Terry McDermott, who also happened to be a former Liverpool and Newcastle teammate and legend, found the quality had dropped off a cliff since their playing days. Out of shape, in their 40s, retired for several years. After a few practice sessions, they strongly believed they were the best players employed by the club, which is an indictment that really speaks for itself, doesn't it? Still, there was promise in Newcastle's youth ranks. This included Lee Clark, Steve Watson, Steve Howie, Alan Thompson, and Robbie Elliott, many of whom would soon make their names known in every household, not before Keegan imprinted his vision on them. There were stories of how Steve Watson would take throw-ins by doing a somersault. Keegan couldn't believe his beloved Newcastle had resorted to these kinds of gimmicks, let alone that the Toon faithful weren't more visibly disgusted at it. He wanted Newcastle to be known for a dynamic, attacking, entertaining football, not party tricks. He was old school. He demanded unapologetic intensity, commitment, and character. One such testament to that was a moment where he dropped Lee Clark from a game. In a training match where Keegan himself participated, Clark tackled Keegan from behind with a knee-high challenge. In retaliation, goalkeeper Pavel Srnicek launched a roundhouse kick towards Clark. As the story goes, neither were punished. Their passion was what Keegan was after, further proven by the fact that both stayed at the club until 1997 and 1998 respectively. When Keegan arrived, Newcastle boasted a record of 29 points from 30 games. Less than a point a game in the second division is simply not good enough for a club of this stature. After Keegan's arrival, the club produced 23 points in 16 and managed to avoid relegation by only 4 points. Tangible proof that the gamble was worth it. Keegan's arrival had literally saved the club. For the Premier League's first year in existence, Newcastle did not compete, but that was probably a good thing. There was still much work to be done. At one point in his first season, Keegan was so frustrated at the perceived lack of support in the transfer market from the ownership that he quit. He returned pretty quickly after Sir John Hall committed to the investment. In honor of that commitment, newcomers appeared in just about every area of the pitch. Perhaps the two most notable stories of the incomings were Rob Lee of Charlton and club record signing Andy Cole of Bristol City. Rob Lee was apparently convinced to join only when Keegan claimed that Newcastle was closer to London, where his family lived, than Middlesbrough, another club after his signature. Geographically, not exactly accurate, but by matter of convenience and connections, probably true. And then there was Andy Cole.
Cole had been a gamble at £1.75 million. At 21, he was a player for the future. Kevin Keegan had risked his biggest transfer fee to date on a young man still to score at the highest level.
Who knows? Next year he could well be the best striker in the country.
Former Arsenal Academy graduate, 21 years old, and one of the most dangerous strikers in the league. £1.75 million later, and he was scoring 12 goals in his first 12 Newcastle appearances. The 92-93 year proved to be a dream. The Magpies exploded out the gates, winning their first 11 league games on the bounce. This skyrocketed them into pole position, where they remained until the end of the year. On the final day of the season, Newcastle celebrated promotion in real style, hammering Leicester City 7-1 to secure the First Division Championship. 8 points clear of the runners-up, Keegan's men played with a certain swagger and attacking bravery that would soon capture national and global attention. Keegan may not have been a coach born from conventional pathways or elite coaching academic education, but he knew how to win, further proven by his lack of fear in making big decisions. In the summer of '93, he sold his top scorer, David Kelly, and other key players that earned them promotion, judging that they may not be Premier League caliber. In the same motion, he brought back 32-year-old Peter Beardsley from Everton. Beardsley was actually a former Newcastle player himself, but clearly still had a lot to give. Newcastle's Premier League debut in '93-94 was nothing short of remarkable. Long gone were the days of battling relegation, a new era was upon us. And with this squad, Keegan's side took the Premier League by storm, finishing third in their very first season back. Newcastle would usually set up in a fluid 4-4-2 or 4-3-3 with an emphasis on width and forward movement. Wingers and attacking fullbacks were crucial to stretching play. The midfield was tasked with supplying the forwards quickly and directly. People watching on began a bit of a love affair with the Geordie boys that was rooted in the swashbuckling, head-bobbing football that was on display. This team knew one tactic, and one tactic alone: attack. All out attack. Keegan's wish to become a thrilling side was granted, as Newcastle, again in their first season in the First Division after 5 years, outscored everyone else, and in true swashbuckling style, had the worst defense in the top 5. The boss accepted that his vision would cause a lot of bleeding at the back, but he was prepared to take the risk on how lethal those shots would be. At St James's Park especially, Newcastle were known to overwhelm opponents with waves of attacks. The motto was simple: score more than them. They would just as easily win 5-0 on a wonderful day and lose 4-3 in heartbreak. And remember those scorelines because they'll come up again. Striking duo Andy Cole and Peter Beardsley racked up 65 goals combined in all competitions, 55 in the league. Andy Cole in particular had what remains one of the most astonishing seasons in Premier League history to this very day. 34 goals in a single season, 13 assists to match, more than anyone else on both counts. For that, he picked up the PFA Young Player of the Year award, and he definitely would have claimed both the FWA and Players Player trophies in normal conditions. However, he was up against Alan Shearer and Eric Cantona for those, so it was never going to be easy. And also, this serves as a reminder to all of us of what the football climate was at the time. Cantona, Shearer, Cole, players of each of the top 3 teams in the land: Manchester United, Blackburn Rovers, and Newcastle United. Man United were the outright top dogs in the mid-90s, and the only 2 teams that were believed to have a chance of dethroning them for a long time were Rovers and Newcastle only. As for Newcastle, things were only ramping up. St James's Park was being modernized and expanded to meet the booming demand. The mood on Tyneside had flipped from despair to euphoria. Neutrals began switching allegiances. The waiting list to watch Keegan's boys grew larger and larger by the day, and by this point, a nickname for this team had sprouted and was doing the rounds. They were known simply as the Entertainers. In 94-95, Newcastle had expectations around them, expectations that they fully lived up to for the first 11 games. First place, 9 wins, 2 draws, all with that scintillating style. Ambitious fans dared to dream of winning the club's first league championship since 1927. I mean, could you imagine the story? However, inconsistencies crept in and the club's lack of depth was exposed. As Manchester United and Blackburn Rovers leaped forward and continued to battle for supremacy throughout the year, Newcastle drifted towards a 6th place finish, helped in large part due to a bit of spice involving Andy Cole.
£6 million plus the £1 million rated Keith Gillespie, the biggest deal in British transfer history. Cole, the hero of St James's Park, now at Old Trafford.
It's not a gamble from my point of view, it's really strategy. I'm looking to improve the club. There's 2 ways it can go from here, you know. If I get it wrong, well, you know, I know what the consequences are.
Cole and Keegan had a falling out after a drop in form, with Keegan and Newcastle making the decision that they wanted to restructure, a decision that seemingly did not sit well with Cole himself.
Yeah, it came as a very big surprise to me, I knew nothing about it till yesterday evening. It was difficult, because I never wanted to leave Newcastle.
This happened in the middle of the season, and out of all the teams Newcastle could have sold to, Manchester United.
I never thought we could ever get him. It's a pleasant surprise that we got the opportunity.
A big shock. I think it's a shock to you boys as well, because no one thought that Kevin Keegan would sell me like arch rivals Man United, but I'm looking forward to it.
Cole was adored, a record-breaking goal machine, and only 23 years old. Fans could not wrap their heads around how this was allowed to happen. There were protests and public anger directed at Keegan and the board. It was the first time Keegan's judgment was widely questioned. How could Newcastle ever catch up? Keegan, to his credit, faced the backlash head-on. In an act that you rarely see in the game, he addressed a crowd of supporters directly outside the stadium to explain the situation. He assured the fans that there was a plan. While sad to see him go, the £6 million they got for Cole was put to good use and added on to the mountain of cash that Sir John Hall was about to endow Keegan's side with. David Ginola, Les Ferdinand, Faustino Asprilla, Warren Barton, David Batty, and more. In total, in the year 1995, Newcastle spent £30 million on players. Soon the Toon faithful had forgotten their outrage as Newcastle entered the 95-96 season with what seemed like an unstoppable aura to them. And on that note, at this point, I think it's appropriate for me to digress a tiny bit and talk about Blackburn Rovers. Perhaps it shouldn't surprise anyone to know that Blackburn Rovers and Newcastle United had quite a lot more in common in those days than I've already described. Rovers were in the 2nd division as recently as 1992. Both clubs were bankrolled by a local magnate that decided to seduce a former Liverpool legend from Liverpool's most successful era ever into bringing glory for their respective clubs. Kevin Keegan was the man for Newcastle, Kenny Dalglish was the man for Blackburn, and funnily enough, Dalglish was actually Keegan's replacement when he left Liverpool as a player. Both wore the number 7 and everything. Perhaps some subtle foreshadowing. Blackburn Rovers had pulled off something remarkable the year prior, dethroning Manchester United to become the best team in the country. And now, to complete the matching pair, the widespread belief was that Newcastle United were answering the call. Selling Andy Cole proved to be a great choice. The squad was more balanced, more unpredictable. Cole's absence was filled by the goals of Les Ferdinand, with 25 in his debut year with them, enough to bag him the PFA Players Player of the Year. The tactics were more or less unchanged. 4-4-2, wing play, 2 strikers up top, whom the entire team was tasked with feeding, and fed them they did. David Ginola, Keith Gillespie and Peter Beardsley were immaculate in the final third, offering the perfect corridor to Ferdinand. Darren Peacock, a rock in the heart of defence, was named Newcastle's Player of the Year, and for good reason. Defence was never a strong point of this Newcastle side, as we've already covered, but there was a marked improvement this season. Still, the worst in the top 5 in terms of goals conceded come the end of the year, but nevertheless, good enough, and the team was scoring enough to take pole position and grip it tightly from match day 1 through 25. By Christmas time, Newcastle's lead stretched up to 12 points, with United in second place needing to play later in the match week to catch up. Naturally, fans had already began the celebrations. The joy was 69 years in the making, and this was compounded by the fact that Blackburn had fallen off a cliff and Manchester United, oddly enough, were written off from the very start of the year following a 3-1 loss to Aston Villa on open day. This prompted a very infamous quip from pundit and former Liverpool legend, because of course he was, Alan Hansen.
You can't win anything with kids. The trick of winning the championship is having strength and depth. They just haven't got it.
The early Manchester United side that had gripped the Premier League from the beginning of the competition had begun to age out, and instead of going into the transfer market, Alex Ferguson decided to rely heavily on a team that was comprised of players 22 and younger, believing in Manchester United's academy. Now, look, in hindsight, knowing what we know now, it's easy to mock Hansen's opinion, but he had a point. Gary Neville, Phil Neville, David Beckham, Paul Scholes, Ryan Giggs, they were all very talented, but they were green. What we only learned later was that Roy Keane, Steve Bruce and Peter Schmeichel, among others, was all the seniority needed to keep Newcastle honest. Them, and of course Captain Eric Cantona, who had just returned from a kung fu kick-induced ban, and manager Alex Ferguson, who was at his bubblegum chewing peak. Keegan and Newcastle United were way out ahead, but were in uncharted territory. The pressure was mounting game after game, and they began to falter. Their free-flowing style left far too many openings for the opponent to pounce, and points were dropped left, right and centre. Notably, points were dropped in a 4-3 defeat to Liverpool, in a game that may as well have been played without defenders at all. Liverpool were playing with 3 at the back and 2 strikers. Newcastle were playing a 4-1-3-2 with the 3-2 basically all being attackers. 29 shots for Liverpool, 12 for Newcastle, a neutral's dream. Around New Year's 1996, Newcastle were 12 points ahead. Come late February, the gap had been closed to 4, and come early March, 1. Courtesy of a defeat at the hands of Manchester United. Newcastle then lost 3 of their next 5, and all of a sudden, Manchester United's kids claimed the top spot for the first time that season, 30 games into the year. The psychological strain on Newcastle was insurmountable, and it all came to a head when Alex Ferguson, master of mind games, made an interesting comment following a win versus Leeds.
Why are they not up the top 6? For some of them, it's more important to get a result against Manchester United to stop and win the week than anything else. Of course, when they come to Newcastle, you wait to see the difference.
With the gap at 2 points, with only 3 to play, Leeds had Newcastle the very next week, and Ferguson was seemingly adamant in making sure they played the game of their lives against Keegan's boys, insinuating that the level of effort that teams like Leeds produced against non-Manchester United teams was questionable. Newcastle, and especially Kevin Keegan, were livid.
When you do that with footballers like he said about Leeds, I've kept really quiet, but I'll tell you something, he went down in my estimation when he said that.
He went on to emphasize that Man United still needed to play and win against the tough Middlesbrough, and that he would be watching watching closely for them to slip up.
And I'll tell you, honestly, I will love it if we beat them. Love it.
This is probably the most famous Premier League interview of all time. The unbridled energy, the human emotion, and the offense taken. In the end, the world was deprived of what would probably be the most replayed clip in sporting history had things gone differently. Newcastle's season fizzled down to 2 draws in the last 2 games and 2nd place. 4 points adrift, the Geordie dream, unfortunately, never materialized. In truth, Newcastle's undoing in 95-96 was a mixture of a few things. Bad luck and probably a bit of naivety with the all-out attack approach, but that's hardly something we can fault them for. Were it not for the desire to entertain, we likely would not have gotten this team in the first place. And they did push on. In fact, in the summer of 1996, the best striker on the planet was on the market, Alan Shearer. With Blackburn on a severe downturn and Shearer already being want away, he was the subject of a continental bidding war ranging from Manchester to Madrid. In the end, none of their interest mattered for one simple reason. Alan Shearer was born and raised in Newcastle. For a world record fee of £15 million, Shearer was unveiled to the club faithful in all his glory, and he delivered immediately. Having won the previous 2 Premier League Golden Boots, he made it 3 in a row with the 96-97 season's haul of 25 in 31 games. As Sir John Hall explained the move, like most Geordies, eventually, they all want to come home. This move isn't about money, it's about bringing a player back to his hometown club. On the overall, Newcastle season again started brightly. No doubt the brightest moment was a 5-0 clobbering of Manchester United. Just look at the smiles, you can only imagine how sweet this victory was, especially with the added knowledge that this left Man United in 5th place, 5 points adrift, while simultaneously propelling another title push for Newcastle. Sadly, it just was not meant to be. We never truly know what goes on inside everyone's minds and the battles they wage against themselves. What we can only assume is that the emotional burden of 95-96, combined with the ever-growing pressure to deliver Newcastle's first trophy in decades, weighed heavily on Kevin Keegan. After a very difficult end-of-year schedule that saw Newcastle go winless in 7 and drop to 4th, Keegan had made up his mind. January 8th, 1997, the team still in 4th place, only 5 points off leaders Liverpool and 3 points off eventual champions Manchester United. Newcastle United made an announcement.
Football Club today announced the resignation of manager Kevin Keegan. Kevin informed the board of his wish to resign, having decided he no longer wishes to continue in football management at this stage in his life. Both parties agreed that the best route forward was for the club to reluctantly accept his resignation with immediate effect.
It was a sad, sad day for onlookers. It was a sad, sad day for players. Many of the players that had recently joined the club, and you'd have to imagine many that were lined up to join, only did so thanks to the chance of working with Kevin Keegan. Unfortunately for them, their timing was off. He was tired.
He left only a brief official explanation.
It was my decision and my decision alone to resign. I feel that I have taken the club as far as I can and that it would be in the best interest of all concerned if I resign now.
In a game of managerial merry-go-round, Kenny Dalglish, former manager of Blackburn, took over the reins at Newcastle. For the 2nd time, Kevin Keegan was replaced by Kenny Dalglish. Dalglish steered Newcastle clear of very possible demise following Keegan's departure, finishing 2nd. But he did not last long after that, as Newcastle plunged from title contention to mid-table immediately the following year and for the foreseeable future. As following managers reined the club's attacking tendencies in for a more pragmatic style, the club began to lose the edge that won them games in the first place. Keegan would later return to Newcastle for a brief, much more turbulent spell 11 years later in 2008. Interestingly, a return that saw both him and Alan Shearer both hold the managerial title at various points in 08-09 as Newcastle were eventually relegated. A far cry from the first time around. But we don't want to dwell on that too much. It is his first spell in the 90s that remains the stuff of legends. When Keegan joined Newcastle, he quite literally had no idea what was going on and no experience. Despite that, he had a vision and knew the standards required to climb out of the hole the club had dug itself in. And just for the record, you should know that it was all about football. Alex Ferguson and Kevin Keegan have since reconciled and joked on the "I will love it" rant several times. Ferguson, of all people, probably understood what was going on here more than anyone else. The passion, the raw emotion, the all or nothing, that was why everyone fell in love with this Newcastle team. So again, we come back and address the elephant in the room. Could Keegan have cemented an even more unbreakable legacy with a bit more pragmatism in key moments? Probably yes. But I'm going to go ahead and guess that even the slightest bit of compromise here would have been unacceptable. After all, Kevin Keegan's Newcastle, from start to finish, were always true to their name. So I guess the only question left to ask is, are you not entertained?